By the 19th century, the creed of conquest had found new scripture in the language of science and economics. Steam engines, rifles, and telegraphs gave European empires reach and speed that earlier crusaders could only imagine. The same nations that spoke of liberty and brotherhood now spoke of improvement and development. The vocabulary changed, but the mission remained: to remake the world in their own image, to judge entire peoples by their distance from that image. In Africa, the partition of a continent was staged in conference rooms hung with maps and oil paintings. Belgium's King Leopold II declared himself the personal custodian of the Congo, promising philanthropy and enlightenment. In practice, he extracted ivory and rubber through a regime of forced labor and terror that killed millions. Clergymen blessed expeditions that left villages burned and hands severed, convinced that civilization could be measured in exports and baptisms. France called its colonial system La Mission Civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. In Algeria, it meant the seizure of land, the confinement of tribes, the deliberate dismantling of language and custom. The Republic, newly secular, kept the old ecclesiastical rhythm: confession, conversion, penance. It was simply the world now that was to be purified, one colony at a time. Across the Atlantic, Britain perfected empire as an industry. The same government that outlawed the slave trade reinvented forced labor through contract and taxation. On Caribbean plantations, freed men worked for starvation wages while London congratulated itself on moral progress. In India, imperial economists treated famine as a lesson in free market discipline. When crops failed, grain continued to be exported. Hunger was recast as proof of native indolence. 4 great famines in less than half a century, tens of millions dead, were met not with remorse but with lectures on providence and efficiency. Meanwhile, in Australia and North America, frontier theology found new converts. Settlers invoked destiny, progress, and God's will to cleanse the land of those deemed unfit for ownership. Aboriginal and native nations were pushed to the edges of existence, their erasure recorded in treaties and statistics. In each case, the Western imagination saw its violence as a kind of harvest, necessary, regrettable, but ultimately redemptive. Beneath all of it ran the same moral current: the belief that guilt and virtue were collective, inherited, and easily assigned. The colonized were guilty of backwardness, the conqueror virtuous by birthright. When industrialization magnified the scale of power, this current turned into ideology. Pseudo-scientific theories of race gave empire a new theology dressed in laboratory coats. The measuring tape replaced the catechism, but both served the same hierarchy. By 1900, Western Christendom's political heirs governed most of the planet. They built railways, parliaments, and prisons. They exported law codes and looted art. They spoke of progress as if it were charity and of exploitation as if it were education. Every monument of reason cast a long shadow of coercion. The modern world was born in that light and shadow together. Then came the reckoning. In 1914, the nations that had divided the earth turned their weapons inward. The First World War exposed the lie of moral superiority more brutally than any critic could have written. Industrial slaughter consumed a generation. Churches blessed battalions on every side. Each empire called its dead martyrs to civilization. The rhetoric of mission survived even as civilization itself sank into the trenches. By the late 20th century, Western Christendom had become largely secular, yet its sense of moral election endured. Economic doctrines replaced catechisms. Markets supplanted sacraments. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank offered structural adjustment as penance and redemption. Nations of the Global South were lectured on transparency and efficiency by governments whose wealth was built on centuries of extraction. The forms changed, the logic endured. Those deemed enlightened would guide, discipline, and if necessary punish those still in darkness. And in the new century, the rhetoric of virtue found its loudest voice in war once more. Humanitarian intervention, regime change, the war on terror, each was sold as a moral duty. The vocabulary of crusade returned without the crosses. Missiles were launched to liberate, sanctions imposed to protect. Civilians killed by drones were collateral to democracy. In global capitals, speeches praised human rights while secret prisons operated beyond law. Torture was rebranded as interrogation, occupation as reconstruction. The promise of individual dignity became the justification for collective punishment. Meanwhile, the same societies that preached equality at home built walls against refugees created by their own interventions. They condemned intolerance abroad while funding it when convenient. They celebrated diversity yet maintained global systems of economic dependency that mirror the old hierarchies of empire. The West no longer calls itself Christendom, but its moral posture remains missionary, convinced that history is a sermon and it the chosen preacher. Even within its borders the pattern persists. Entire communities are judged by inherited suspicion, entire generations burdened with unpayable debts. The myth of meritocracy disguises the continuity of privilege. Justice is individual only when guilt is convenient, otherwise it expands to tribes, classes, and nations. The principle of judge not survives in scripture but not in policy. As the 21st century unfolds, the language of virtue grows louder precisely because its substance grows thin. Climate summits framed as moral crusades stall over profit, peace prizes are awarded amid drone strikes. The same governments that claim to defend the international order ignore it whenever power demands. In every justification echoes the ancient refrain, we act not out of greed or fear, but for the good of mankind. Yet the evidence, spread across continents and centuries, tells a simpler story. The civilization that claims to have abolished inherited guilt continues to practice it on a planetary scale. Its victims change names and faces, but the pattern endures: collective judgment, selective memory, moral exemption for the self. The armistice was followed by denial. The victors redrew borders and renamed their dominance as trusteeship. Colonies became mandates, subjects, wards. Yet the machinery that had crushed Europe's youth now turned again on the non-European world, updated with aircraft and ideology. When the next war came, it was not a failure of Western values but their logical continuation, technological power serving a hierarchy convinced of its own virtue. The Holocaust, the bombing of cities, the mushroom cloud over Japan, these were not eruptions from outside civilization but creations from its core. A culture that had spent centuries perfecting control, classification, and righteous violence finally turned those tools upon itself. After 1945, Western moral authority should have been buried with the rubble. Instead, it was resurrected. Under the banner of reconstruction and freedom, the old empires re-emerged in new forms. The United States inherited Britain's mantle as the global guardian of order. Europe reinvented itself as a community of peace. Colonial independence movements were tolerated only when they aligned with strategic interest. Elsewhere they were suppressed in the name of stability. The Cold War translated the ancient struggle between faiths into a contest between ideologies. Once again, the world was divided into the righteous and the fallen, the free and the enslaved. Missionary zeal reappeared in the language of containment and development. If you like this video, support this channel by subscribing, liking, leaving a comment or sharing. Once again, the Time Trotter signing off.